Hello.
Well, it's so good to see many of you, and so glad that others are here as well. Let me begin by welcoming you all back for part 2 of our adult education class and series called Pathways. And we are considering a better Christian witness on the issue of race. So let me say that I'll just say a few words to begin. I'll open us up in prayer, and then I'll turn it over to our guest, Dr. Bacote, to facilitate or to share with us. I did want to mention just to begin, I mentioned something at the beginning of last week about how our church, our broad church, is thinking about this issue of racial justice. One of the things in the last year that our church has done is to become what's called a Matthew 25 congregation. This is a denominational-wide effort based on Matthew chapter 25 that has 3 areas of focus, and those 3 are congregational vitality, systemic poverty, and structural racism. And so every church, or those who have signed on to become Matthew 25 congregations, are thinking deeply and seeking to respond to each of these areas. I just wanted to begin by reading a portion of that passage from Matthew 25, when it is a bit of a apocalyptic passage, or one that looks to the fulfillment of God's kingdom. And what is recounted by Jesus in that scripture, he says, "Come, you that are blessed by my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me. I was naked, and you gave me clothing. I was sick, and you took care of me. I was in prison, and you visited me." I encourage you to look deeper into Matthew 25 under a section that's called Judgment of the Nations. But we do know that Jesus calls us to meet the needs of our neighbor. And during this class, we are thinking about how to love God and love our neighbor. So if you would, as we begin tonight, let's join in a word of prayer. Gracious Father, thank you for the gift and blessing of being able to join together tonight to study, to learn, to grow together. I thank you for Dr. Bacote and for his sharing with us tonight, and pray that you will bless this conversation and broaden our awareness, open our eyes, deepen our relationship with you as we consider this issue of racial justice and how to think from the inside out to look to Dr. Bacote's informed and biblical perspective, that it might help us take our next step toward a future that is the beloved community that we each desire. And we pray all these things in Jesus' name. Amen. Dr. Bacote, I will turn it over to you, and thank you so much for joining us again tonight.
Thanks. It's great to be here again, and I'll start just like I did last week, because I don't want to assume that everyone who's here was here last week. So if you were here last week, this will be familiar. If not, I'm saying it's important. Well, for a lot of issues, but perhaps especially when it comes to questions of race and when someone's presenting on that, because of the challenges with the topic, the volatility with the topic, the tensions that often rise with the topic. It's important to think about our disposition when we are engaged in this kind of topic. And so I invite you to have what I call a tell me more disposition, rather than a yeah, but disposition. A tell me more disposition, because even if you don't understand what I'm saying, or if you disagree with what I'm saying, you want to enter into conversation. Whereas if you have a yeah, but disposition, you are spending your time preparing your response. And you are preparing yourself, kind of like a spring-loaded, anything with that spring-loaded, let's put it that way. You're preparing yourself to launch back with some kind of response that is often, in my experience, a kind of whataboutism or what ifism or something that basically is a ready-made response. And when a person has that kind of disposition of being ready to react like that, it is not a posture where actual communication can take place, because it's a situation where one is waiting just for their space to assert what they already know about the situation. And there's a lot to learn about this for all of us. And so I'd like to invite us into the tell me more posture, because there's just more for us to learn. So it's something I like to ask everyone to do. Again, if you heard me say this last week, then it's very familiar. If you are new, it is something that came to my mind a couple of years ago, because I was thinking about how do you try to set the stage so that there can be at least a dialogical reality at work, even if there is disagreement that takes place. And a lot of times on this topic, there isn't the entering into dialogue. There is the parrying, so to speak, of mutual assertions that happens. And if you are parrying back and forth with mutual assertions, what you are doing then is only thinking about saying what you want to say and framing things as you wish to frame them, and you're not trying to learn. And all of us have things that we can learn. At the very least, we can learn about why people understand things as they do and what they've experienced in their lives. And at least we can have an understanding of why they are where they are. To even do that, much less to get into other dimensions of talking about the topic, requires us to be willing to enter into a dialogical reality. So a tell me more posture allows us to do that. So I would invite you to do that. Two stories to share real quickly before getting into something that kind of picks up from where I was last week. Actually, three things. One thing, the thing I'll say, and two is the two stories thing. The thing I'll say is, if you had questions from last week, please write them down and be ready to. And let's start with those from last week when I'm done, in case you have those. So I want to just give you the opportunity to pose those questions if you didn't get to do that last week. So I wanted to mention that. The two stories. The first one is a friend of mine on Twitter pointed out that he had gotten a communication from a fellow pastor. This friend's a pastor. And it was from a pastor who had been fired by his church because he decided to talk about race and justice. And why am I telling you this? You're like, hey, our pastor invited you. He's not getting fired. Well, that's fantastic. That's part of the reason why I want to share the story, because I'm glad that there's at least the willingness to venture toward this rather than to enter into a disposition of resistance to all of this. But the thing I want to highlight about this is that that person in that is the only. There are pastors who, some are afraid to talk about this because they know that either people will leave, or a lot of people will leave, or they might lose their job because people think that they've been co-opted because they're talking about race. And I think one of the things that shows us is, and this goes back actually to the tell me more posture, a lot of times when people are reacting to this, they're pretty sure they know what it is. And some of the people that are most willing to fire people are people that are sure that if you talk about race, that strangely you're a person who has a house full of flags with a hammer and sickle on it. In other words, you're a Marxist. So this is not a new accusation, but for many people, they think you're getting off message, you're not preaching the gospel, you're doing all this other stuff. So I just want to point out that this is a very real thing that is out there. And part of the challenge of that is the challenge of people actually doing the work to make sure they understand what's being said. I mean, I'd love to somehow take a survey of people who had their pastor fired because of talking about race and justice. And I'd love to know what the people thought they were hearing when they heard the words, we should talk about race, or we should talk about justice. And what the pastor intended when he said, let's talk about race, let's talk about justice. I have a sense that those things do not resonate, what people thought that they would hear and what the pastor wanted to communicate. It really takes time, patience, and a lot of work to get in the place for there to be the kind of just mutual understanding so that we can move forward talking about this. And a lot of times this does not happen. So it's sad that happened to that pastor, and it's happened to others. I hope that doesn't keep happening, but I fear that it will in some contexts. So that's the first story. The second story is yesterday I came across some information from a Barna study that said that in the last, I guess, 6 months maybe, or last year, the percentage of white Christians who said that there was nothing to talk about race increased from 16% to 36%. Now, on the one hand, it's better than that it went from 16% to 60%. But the fact that it went up at all is an indicator that something is going on where people think that if you're talking about race, that somehow you're entering into an act of either inventiveness, you're talking about something that is not there, or you are talking about certain political commitments that are corrosive or destructive to the social order. I think, again, that kind of survey just reveals to us that what we're dealing with when we are talking about these questions of race is something that is like what I would call a skillfully mutating virus. That even when you think you've finally done the right things to end it, next thing you know, it's back in a slightly modified form. It's hard to kill. It shouldn't actually be a surprise to us that it's hard to kill, because I don't think I used this analogy last week, but I think it's an important one to use. If for most of the history of the United States of America, by law, the United States has put in place racial hierarchy, racial discrimination, antagonizing, or forget antagonizing, disallowing the full citizenship of African Americans. And that it's only been 1964, 65 since we got laws that address that. It's not like the legislation just made everything that happened before Lyndon Johnson wrote those laws. It did make those things just go away. And the momentum there was, who thought it's proper to have a society with racial hierarchy by law. That momentum isn't immediately stopped because Lyndon Johnson signed a piece of paper, right? And then he signed another one the next year. So that momentum continues because it's been built into the structure of the country. It's like the DNA. So when that's the case, even though things get better, it actually should not surprise us that it's really hard for it to just go away. I see one question already. I will get to that question. That will be question number 1 when I'm done. So thank you, Ed. I will address that question. Thank you. So the momentum, or if you will, the construction of a kind of psyche of a country, when it has, racism built into it, it takes a long time for that to really change. When you have over 2 centuries of keeping that in place, right? We can go back to 1619, I suppose, but let's at least say 250 years before 1964 and 65. If you've got that much, and then you only have 55 or 56 years after that, it's really optimistic to think that it just stopped everything in 50 years, right? Because so much has been put in place already. So that shouldn't surprise us, that we have that work to do, and that even though people a lot of times have good intentions, it's hard to completely get rid of this thing, or close to get rid of this thing. So we have to keep at it. And in keeping at it, we have to keep at it in a way that is a very long game, like you're participating in a marathon, not in a sprint. So that has to be part of what we're doing. All right, so having said that, which was a rather long preamble, I understand, let me sort of pick up where I was last week. Last week, I talked about 2 of the values on the landing page. You say about us at First Presbyterian Church of Wheaton. I talked about the first 2, and it occurred to me that I should at least attempt equal time for the second 2. So I will. And just as a preview, next week, I'm going to talk about the membership questions that are given. And then I'm going to, the next week, talk about the ends of the church language. So, and what I'm doing with all of this is trying to help us think about what is already in place, what is already believed, what is already confessed, and how is that a trajectory out of which to begin addressing this, or continue addressing this in light of your beliefs and in particular your version, your particular language in terms of these beliefs. So in that regard, number 3 of the values is joyful generosity. I guess you all could have told me that, but I said it like I'm introducing it to you. But on the web, there it is on the website. So joyful generosity, and there are 2 questions that are not necessarily specific to race, but they certainly carry over into addressing race, and they're really important. The first one is this. So if you're a community of joyful generosity where you're thinking about giving, and let's say it's giving in various ones, because giving is not just about writing checks, right? There's, people say time, talent, treasure, right? In the giving of yourself, or of your time, or of your talent, or of your treasure, what is your disposition toward, quote unquote, others when you're doing the giving? What about them, the recipient? How are they being regarded by you? And again, the reason why I say that this isn't just about race, this can be about class, this can be gender, members of the family, if you know what I mean by I say it, by those members of the family. It can be, lots of different kinds of people. But specific to race, if you're thinking about how your giving is contributing to addressing the question of race in some way, how are you thinking about those that you want to be the recipient of your giving? Or if there's something you're doing in terms of investment, let's say that someone in your church is very interested in economic development in, say, Lawndale or Woodlawn, or neighborhood like that. What is your disposition towards that neighborhood and the people in that neighborhood when you're doing that giving? It's very important because you have to be able to understand them as someone that is in need. So we can't be pretending about that. But there are things that do not have to happen when you recognize that someone is in need. You can dignify the person that is in need, or you can dehumanize the person that is in need. You can regard them as, oh, it's just so sad. And when you say it's just so sad, what is, creeping beneath the surface of you saying just so sad is, they're just not like me. Then you fill in the blank. And of course, sometimes there are other beliefs about those people or the other persons behind that. So there's kind of the willingness to do it, but it's kind of done with a, let's put it this way: there's at least the temptation toward a condescension toward the one that is receiving, rather than a dignifying of the one that's receiving, rather than a responsiveness to the God who made you and the God who made them, and you having gratitude and seeking to serve. And in seeking to serve, you're thinking about, how can I help? But when you're recognizing that the one you can help is not just someone who perhaps only needs you, but can probably even be someone who maybe helps you in some ways. Even if they are not able to give to you the way that you are able to give to them, or the way that you are able to help catalyze their economic empowerment in some way. So I think that question of regard is a very important question for us when we're thinking about giving. Because the great thing about being able to give is that you can pass on from to others things that you're able to pass on because of God's blessings to you, God's blessings in various ways. The temptation is to somehow see yourself as fundamentally different from the person that's receiving. And sometimes that fundamental difference can be because they aren't just a poor person, or a person that's not as well educated, or has been down on their luck or whatever, but there can be a way that you're also thinking, well, that's kind of how they are, and they really are in such need. And so the condescension can creep in. So I think it's important for us in any situation like that, but race as well, to think about, what is my disposition toward the others? So if you're thinking about it from the standpoint of First Presbyterian as a church, if, let's say that the reputation of First Presbyterian as a generous congregation is one where people go, we have really found First Presbyterian to be so generous, helping with, to keep with the same example, helping with economic empowerment. And then the question is, somebody might say, well, what have your interactions been like when they've done it? What would you want them to say? What would you want the reputation to be? Not just about the fact that, hey, deep pockets over there at First Presbyterian, but there's just something about them. Not just, there's something about who all dispose themselves in their generosity toward those in need, and particularly toward those in need who are non-white. I think that there's an opportunity there, but to, I think, live into that opportunity. I think it's important to ask. Again, I make no accusations. It's just an important question to ask. In being generous, how is the other regarded? How is the other seen? So, important question. Then a follow-up question to this is, what is your hope for them upon doing the giving? What do you really believe they're capable of? Or are there ideas you already have about the limitations of their capability? Another brief story. Back in the 1970s, when I was growing up, I remember how enthusiastic my parents and relatives were when James Harris became the starting quarterback for the Los Angeles Rams. So James Harris was an African American, or well, he's still alive actually, so is. And he led the Rams to the playoffs. And what I didn't understand at the time was the reason that was a big deal, because there were a lot of other players, running backs, defensive backs, wide receivers that were African Americans that were scoring, got their bit of glory. What was it about having the black quarterback that seemed to do something for my relatives? And now I understand. It's what people sometimes observe. They say, if you talk about a black quarterback, can you say something other than that they're really athletic? Can you say something about their understanding of the game, about their ability to read defenses? In other words, things that have to do with their leadership ability and things that have to do with their intellect and not just with their brute force, let's say. And the point I'm making here is, when you're thinking about giving to others, what do you think about their potential? Or are there things that you think about someone, and perhaps someone on the basis of their race or ethnicity, that makes you think, well, they're probably only going to go so far? What would be the reason for believing that? What would inform that? I mean, one of the things that we have to keep in mind, based on the history of the way race has worked out in the modern West, is part of what came along with it was an entire discourse about the inferiority, of Black people. Have you ever gone to the DeSable Museum? They have different displays at different times. But one time we went there, and it had these postcards from the 1940s. Very interesting postcards, is all I'll say. Distressing kind of interesting postcards, because there were all kinds of stereotypes about laziness, about being entertaining, but also about being, kind of good to be laughed at, not to be regarded as an equal. And so, and again, please understand, I'll just keep repeating this. I make no accusations. I'm not a mind reader. I don't know what anybody thinks. But regardless of whether I know what anybody thinks, I think these questions have to be asked. We can't move forward having a witness about race, with the church leading the way on race, if we don't say, well, we really did a heart check, a mind check, a gut check. We really interrogated our beliefs, our assumptions, our perceptions of others. We asked what was there. We asked God to show us what was there. We asked God to show us what we didn't recognize or see within ourselves. Or we asked God to expose what we'd rather not acknowledge about ourselves. So I think that's very important. And the context of generosity is a great way into that. All right, the next divided. So the first question around that is, and it's really just a general question about devotion to community, and that is, what's your motivation for devotion to community? Why? Why be devoted to community? Why be devoted to community in a society that says your best life is to have selective community while you pursue your own self-improvement project or self-actualization project? Why be devoted to community when what is advertised to us is, how you get your best self is by having what some of us now call the curated self, one that you can, you are to be admired because of how great your life is. Why be devoted to community more than being devoted to those kind of self-branding projects? And so, and because we're awash with things that tell us that that's what makes our lives good. So if you're having devotion to community, what are the things that are leading you to resist those lures that lead you into a very self-oriented, self-centered type of way of living, rather than a community-oriented way where you're not disregarding your interests, your concerns, your hobbies, etc., but you are placing a high value on being the people of God and being the people of God together. And so you have Acts 2:42 quoted on the web page, and there's devotion to the apostles' teaching. So if that's part of what is part of being this devoted community, the question and there are implications for race with this. If you're devoted to the teaching of the church, right? The apostles are passing on what Jesus passed on to them, right? He said, "Teach them everything I have commanded you," in Matthew 28. If this is the thing to which you are devoted, all of us have to ask, no matter what issue we're dealing with, is how devoted am I really to that? How much do I really want to know what it says? Not, in other words, particularly how much do I want to know what it says when it is sanding off my rough edges? When it is identifying things about myself that I'd rather not have it identified? When it is showing me that the path to Christ likeness is one that is marvelous, but also a transformation process that you definitely feel. Let's put it that way, right? Because the change that you feel isn't always one that you would choose, because sometimes we would just rather be comfortable with the way that we see things and the way we do things. We want to think, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And Jesus says, follow me, listen to me, be transformed by me. So how on board are you with that as being part of being devoted to the community, having that kind of devotion to it? And what are the roadblocks to that? And the reason for asking about this in relationship to race is, I would posit this, and I'll say it, I may have said it last week, I'll say it again, I'll probably say it again the next 2 weeks. If Christians were living up to or aspiring to live up to the fullness of what is passed on to us from Jesus and the apostles, then we would be known for the people leading the way on race. But this is not the reputation of the church. And by the way, when I say leading the way on race, doesn't mean anything about, of course, the first people to protest, the first people, etc. It might mean some people protest because that's the way they're wired and gifted. But I mean people that are also at work with all the subtle ways that race is at work from what goes on within individuals all the way to what goes on to what happens in our socio-political realities, what happens in our businesses, etc. I believe that the church would be the people seeking or leading the way on that, the ones establishing the beachheads. But we're not yet those people. If we have full devotion to the apostles' teaching, I think we will. But what are the roadblocks? So that's a question I think you have to ask yourself. And you ask that about What are the roadblocks for me? What are the roadblocks in our congregation? Then also when it comes to your devotion to community, there's a little question about community itself, which is, close your eyes and imagine the composition of your community. What does it look like? Right? How do you imagine the composition of your community? Now, please understand, if the way that you imagine the composition of your community is that it seemed to be strangely a lot of people that seem to be from, certain geographic regions in Europe, in part, that could simply be the case because that's just who you've been around. So it's what you're not thinking probably, what does my community look like? You're not thinking about a community that has a lot of diversity, probably. Right? If you're in the middle of Idaho, you're not thinking about that, etc. But taking into account the fullness of the teaching of Scripture, if the Christian community is every tribe and tongue and nation, if the Christian community is the fulfillment of what God said to Abram when he said, in you all the earth is going to be blessed, all the nations are going to be blessed. If you have all these different kind of people, then what does it mean to imagine that community at its best? Now, it's easy to say, please understand, that, hey, you teach at Wheaton College, you live in Glen Ellen, you know the demographics around here. Yes, I do know, by the way, that they seem to have changed a little bit since I've been here. There's more presence of some minority groups than there were when I started in Wheaton in 2001. None of which means, wow, aren't we like a multi-ethnic, set of neighborhoods? We're not going there. But my question is, if you could populate the neighborhood with different kinds of people, would you do it? And is that the kind of community that you want to have? And are you willing to do the work to have that kind of community? Because to have that kind of community is hard. It's very counter-cultural. The eschatological vision in Romans 7:9, the great of all these people, the great multitude from every tribe and tongue, to have something like that or a glimpse of that in a community is really a challenge because people have different backgrounds, different cultures, different customs, different ways of doing things, different ways of navigating time, different ways of thinking about what's important, different leadership styles, different ways of understanding how community does things together. And to negotiate all of that takes a lot of work. If you could be a very multi-ethnic, multicultural community, is that really what you would want to be? And are you willing to do the work to do that and to stay in the game? Because it's a hard game. There are lots of intentionally multi-ethnic churches that people have a lot of excitement about, and then it ends. And it ends because of a variety of reasons. One of the reasons it ends is because sometimes people, the people that are in the majority culture, only want a majority culture leader. Sometimes it ends because people have the different leadership styles I was talking about. Sometimes it ends because the people aren't really learning to live together with each other. Or that when they do and they discover differences, they don't know how to negotiate those things well. And their Christian formation isn't helping them to negotiate those things well. Now, mentioning those problems doesn't mean, so imagine a community like that and then give up. That's not my point. My point is just to be upfront about the fact that to pursue a community and to imagine a community that is really multi-ethnic. And I'll say this, by the way, if you say, look, there just aren't that many people around here to make it multi-ethnic, then I would say to at least be a church community that's known of a disposition where you're ready to be multi-ethnic because of what's been happening with the people so that they are ready to make belonging in that community a sense of belonging where people know that it is really their home when they are there. And that they know that they're at home and that they're not visitors. And that they know that they are full-blown participants. If that imagination is there, that's at least staging being able to be a community that has the possibility that, oh, people start showing up and they go, there weren't many of us here, but I was immediately part of the family. And I wasn't immediately part of the family at the cost of cultural suicide. I didn't have to shed my hair or to belong. My cultural attire became part of the mix. Can these things happen? I believe they can, but they're hard things. They're hard things. But that's part of the most important thing I think to happen if there's to be a witness that moves forward on race. Having devoted community, I think, is a great way of thinking about who do we really want to be? What kind of community do we really want to be? By what do we wish to be characterized? Do we at least want to be a community that is ready to be a truly multi-ethnic community, whether we look like that or not? That when people show up who would make us more multi-ethnic, they found out that it's like they were ready-made to be multi-ethnic, even though they weren't very multi-ethnic at all. Something happened that prepared them to be that. That'd be amazing. I think it can happen. But again, we have to be willing to do the work to make that happen. And it's a long, patient, challenging process. But the Christian life is not a life where upon being regenerated, you have instantaneous total sanctification. Presbyterians are not Wesleyans when it comes to how they think about sanctification. Some Wesleyans, okay, let me be fair. Some Wesleyans believe that you can have, through an instantaneous work of the Holy Spirit, what's called being made perfect in love for God, and you can be entirely sanctified. So we can talk about that another time. But my point is that this is not a Presbyterian belief. My point is that if you're a Presbyterian, you believe that sanctification is a process. And if you believe it's a process, then you'll understand that becoming a community that can be one that is multi-ethnic, then that's also part of the process. So your expectation is to be in process, not to just arrive. It'd be great if we could have just arrival, but that's not the way it works on this side of Christ setting everything right when he returns. So with that, I will stop because I think I've gone long enough. And next week, remember, last week you asked me, Vince, what's next week? Now I can tell you what's next week. I'll just reiterate. I'm going to talk about the membership questions next week and how some of the membership questions orient us towards thinking and acting in certain ways around the question of race. So I see that there are 3 questions already. So I will address them. Actually, I think there's 4, sorry. All right, number 1, can you identify the root causes of racism, including those aspects of human nature that foster it? So I think I said last week, but I'll reiterate that I think racism is a species of antagonism toward the neighbor. Okay, so the second greatest commandment is love your neighbor as yourself. Racism is a version of antagonizing love your neighbor as yourself, or resisting love your neighbor as yourself, on the basis of this modern view of race. And modern view of race is a way of categorizing human beings by something called, where you kind of meld biology and culture together, and in categorizing people as Caucasian or Negro or or well, some versions of say Mongoloid, etc. You say that they do not only have certain descriptive features in terms of the complexion, the shape of your nose, your eyes, your eyebrows, what kind of hair you have, all that type of stuff. Not just those things, phenotype, as they would say in biology. But you also connect to those people certain characteristics about who they are. So if you want to look at something interesting, look at the way Linnaeus, the great scientist, categorized human beings. And look who's on top and look who's on bottom and look who's in between. I won't tell you what answer that point. You can probably guess who's on top. And so the root of racism is in part the construction of a way of categorizing human beings on the basis of race, saying that this is what humans are. You have Caucasians, you have Negroes, you have these Asiatics or Mongoloid people, and you associate with them certain abilities. And because of that, you can also then discern rationally, supposedly, that you can have a hierarchy of certain people over others. And so it makes sense that certain people, they're just supposed to be enslaved because that's their character. Right? So you kind of have a scientifically based reason. It's not really scientifically based, but it's purportedly scientifically based reason for saying, well, this is why we have the structures that we do. Another theological root of racism is simply the doctrine of depravity. Ever since Genesis 3, humans have found ways to regard other human beings as other, and the other is to be under you. They may even look like you a lot, but because they're from a different zip code, so to speak, they're not your people. And so your people are supposed to have dominance over the others. So what do? You find ways to assert dominance. And it's as minimal as, just making sure that they know that you are not to be messed with, all the way to oppressing and killing people. So people have been doing that from the beginning. Racism is a species of that. It's just that it's a dominant based on this categorization of race. Because if you look at the way that people describe human beings prior to, I'd say, the 1600s, you don't have people talking about race the way that we sort of just take it for granted, that there's this race and that race and that race. So that's one of the ways to talk about, I guess, the roots of racism. Someone asks, am I just talking about African Americans or all people of color? Great question. Racism, in terms of the way that the country has worked out in the United States, has obviously, I mean, you could be a white person who was enslaved because of debts or whatever. But generally, slavery was about enslaving descendants of Africans. That was the main population for that. I would say the largest expression of racism in the United States has been, if you will, anti-Black racism. But Native Americans, that's a genocide over here. We made treaties which were good for some people and not so good for others. So that's certainly the destruction of a people on the basis of being those people. Now, I know some people might say it's fair to ask, well, weren't there Native Americans that were hostile? Oh, yes. No question about it. But attending to their hostility doesn't necessarily mean that you need to destroy them, that you need to obliterate them. So I think that's, I think there are ways you could perhaps subdue with your superior military power these people without having to have a strategy where you, if you don't destroy them, you put them away. You put them on reservations. Generally, I'd say the larger expression of racism in the United States has been anti-Black, but of course, I mean, against Asians, against Latinos, against different that there's been racism structurally, particularly towards different groups of non-whites in different ways, but the central feature, I would guess, of racism in the United States, in addition to Native Americans, is with Black Americans. Because you don't have a history of slavery for Asians, for example, like the ones working on the railroads, etc., like you do for African Americans. You don't have, in other words, it's just not the same scale or the same duration. And the same thing with those that even Latinos is not a great category, but what people will call Latinos, the discrimination is real, but it functioned differently. So, and I do think it's important, by the way, to not get into any kind of, what somebody once called the oppression Olympics. Who's the most oppressed? My view of this is, tell the truth about, all the evils of oppression, and seek to remedy all the evils of oppression, and the good of all people and the flourishing of all people, and attend to the ways that some people have had the effects in various ways of racism in their communities and in their personal lives, etc. I think that's a way to address that. There was another question: the difference between race and ethnicity. Race, as I was just describing it, is more, at least as it was constructed, is trying to say that there's this biological reality. Ethnicity, you think about customs. Sometimes I prefer the word ethnicity to race, because race is not a good category. One, because it's an invention. It's an invention that has operated, as a successful fiction. But, are people in southern Italy the same as people in Liverpool? We call them white. Okay, but they are not anywhere close to looking the same. But they would get under that category. So I think race has never been sufficient for really dealing with the level of diversity of humans. So I think ethnicity is better, because that attends to, you may take into account ethnic characteristics, but you're thinking language, customs. So I prefer ethnicity, actually, but racism is based on the concept of race. Ethnocentrism is more particular, I would say. But it's racism that's put into practice, because you're using racial categories in the laws. So that's how I would make that distinction. Resources for how we as a community will work through that process of preparing ourselves to be that community. There is a book that I don't know how successful it is, honestly, but it's an attempt. So I read these two stages. There's a book Divided by Faith that Michael Emerson and Christian Smith wrote, and then there's the book United by Faith. One moment. This one's called Multiracial Congregations as an Answer to the Problem of Race. So the first author of this is Curtis Paul DeYoung, Deyoung. Michael Emerson is part of that, George Yancey and Karen Chai Kim. So this is probably 2002, 2003, something like that, 2003. Well, I would say that that's a resource to look at. Although I think I saw a headline where one of the authors was talking about what they hoped for with the book, but yet what was really happening. I think you do have to look at the people who are talking about why multi-ethnic church plants fail. So I think you need to study those things. What happened or didn't in those situations? But I think one of the biggest things that happened there was the unwillingness to be led by non-white leadership, and the unwillingness to be truly multicultural as a community. So that there are churches that would be in description, demographics, multi-ethnic or multiracial, but they would be culturally, white Midwestern churches or Southern Californian churches or something. And please understand, the point isn't that everybody needs to have this mythic synthesis of cultures. You're going to have some kind of cultural DNA that's going to be dominating somewhere in that. But how do you do that without suggesting that this culture is what's prominent because this one's the right one? As if this is God's culture. The others, well, maybe put scare quotes around God's culture for theirs, italics on the others, but ours, put it in caps and put it in bold. So I think making sure that the way that the culture operates is one where it's really receptive to the contributions of others is an important dimension there. I think I see a new question. No, I don't. That's the book. Okay, so all right.
Well, we've Dr. Bacote, thank you so much. You've given us so much to ponder and continue to reflect upon.
It's 8 o'clock.
Yeah, I mean, it's flown by. We could be going another hour. But let me pause, because I did this last week and we didn't have any. But is there a final burning question that anyone would want to throw out? And you can unmute yourself if you want to not put it in the chat. But is there a final thought or a final question that anyone wanted to add into the conversation? Well, Dr. Bacote.
Wait. Someone says Colleen's question hasn't been answered.
No, he answered it with all of the like the resources of how those books that he said, and I feel like you answered it.
Okay.
Personally.
Okay.
Good.
Oh, by the way, I would also say, what are the resources in your own denomination already? So the things that Kellen was talking about at the beginning, what are they saying about those strategies? Okay, so what does it mean to be part of this Matthew 25 organization? So because there are a lot of people who are thinking about this, but I think one of the biggest things is learning from people who have to some succeed and what's in between. And it doesn't mean that if it blew up in First Presbyterian, it would blow up the same way. But what are the kinds of things that were going on that led to that? So I think that's important, because I am not of the persuasion, as some are, well, I really think that these were nice ideas to try to have these multi-ethnic churches, but just give it up. Because I believe in the resurrection and Pentecost, I think it can still happen. to some degree on this side of Jesus returning. So that catalyzes my optimism, even when there have been failures.
Well, thank you for that final word, Dr. Bacote, and thank you also for helping us to think through this as a church, as people of faith, as Christians. So will you come back again next week? Will you join us again?
I will. Talking about membership questions.
Okay.
Membership questions. Yes.
We love those membership questions.
Not necessarily that I'm not. Well, not that anyone would really believe at this point that if I said, I'm going to get through all the membership questions with implications for race in 25 minutes. Nobody probably believes that now. But we'll see. I'll start with ones that, would seem to be the most prominent. And we'll see which other ones I might get to.
Yeah, very good. Well, thank you so much again, Dr. Bacote. Thank you all for joining this class, this session tonight as well. So God bless you, and we look forward to seeing you in worship, outdoor on Sunday or live stream. And we do look forward to having you back to this conversation again next week. Thank you so much for joining us.
Bye, everybody. Great to be with you.